Well, good afternoon, everyone. I should say buenas tardes. Today, Neha and I are happy to be here to talk about dynamic triggers, our most recent feature that hasn't been released yet, but actively in development. And I know I have spoken at least to a few of you about it as it was still an idea. And today, we're happy to share some of the details that and the progress that we made. For those of you who don't know me, for example, my name is Vladimir. I'm a product manager here at Salesforce. I currently product leader for the areas that I would like to call schema and metadata. That involves things like custom fields, custom objects, metadata and tooling API, source tracking. And Neha works with me. She is our newest addition to PM family. She switched from engineering, and I'll let her do her introduction actually.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm Neha. And yeah, like Vlad mentioned, I'm the newest addition to his team. I was an engineer with the not far away with the metadata APIs team, and then this year I kind of liked what PMs do, and I decided to make the switch. I have been since I moved, I've been owning the areas of custom metadata types, and now dynamic triggers, and then on the other side, source tracking and metadata coverage. And nice to meet you all.
Yeah, and I'm based in San Francisco, and Neha is based in Boulder, Colorado. So we're not that far away, but we haven't met in person. Can you believe that, guys? Since we started working with each other past pandemic. Let's go to the next slide. No. Okay. Yeah. So I know not one before. We have to do one before. Okay. Yeah. So you most of you know the drill. Forward-looking statement applies more than ever to anything we say. Well, you have a pretty technical feature, and you have two PMs talking about it. That's a setup for trouble. Do not make any purchasing decision on how awesome our presentation is, because it's not yet generally available. It's not even dev preview yet. So please make only purchasing decision based on something that is available with Salesforce today. And with that, we can move to the real content. So hopefully you're all familiar with Apex. If you're not, that might not be presentation for you, unfortunately. So Apex is, our programming language on Salesforce, and you can write Apex triggers, those pieces of code that execute when you save something. What's wrong with Apex trigger today? So Apex trigger today, it's a piece of Apex code that is pretty much, you have to hard code on what entity that trigger will be executed. Let's say you want to define a trigger on account that, I don't know, when you save an account, update some field. And even if you want exactly the same trigger on opportunity, you will have to duplicate that trigger on opportunity, because entity is hard coded into the trigger definition. There are some other things that you're probably well aware of. For example, if you're a managed package developer and you put a trigger in your package just as it is, subscriber will not be able to modify or even disable that trigger. You have to build a complicated framework around it to provide some configuration out of the trigger to the subscriber. The best way, of course, of doing it is through custom metadata types. And there's also a very little transparency in what order particular triggers are going to be executed. If you have few triggers on accounts, you probably would never guess in what order they're going to be executed. And honestly, personally, even I don't know in what order they're going to be executed. You have no transparency into how in what order they executed, and you don't have any control over that order. So those kind of like major problems with Apex triggers as we setting up a stage for what we call dynamic triggers. And the next slide. So dynamic trigger on a contrast with Apex trigger is a hypothetical Apex code that can be executed in say an entity safe order, and it has no knowledge or tight coupling with that entity, meaning that you can define a generic piece of code, piece of Apex code, that can be later executed on any entity of your choice. And dynamic triggers would be able to handle on what particular entities this trigger needs to be executed, which means no more duplicated code, no more um, no more hard-coded entities for your trigger. Uh, as simple as that. And there are other benefits of it that we discovered, but major one is dynamic triggers is a trigger that meant to be executed on multiple entities. That's pretty much you making an abstraction of the logic you want to put in a trigger, rather than tied in this logic to a particular entity. And we go to the next one. So what goes inside the trigger? Um, this is what we like to call dynamic trigger anatomy. Now, think about it. First, this is a pre-dev preview diagram. So things might change. This is the way we're gonna implement it for dev preview. I think this pretty much been set and solid. Things might change, but when we look into a trigger, there are three major components in the trigger. It's a dynamic trigger definition itself that ties it down to Apex class that contains the logic and to a custom metadata types that tells you on what entities you want to execute a dynamic trigger. And also, you can use the same custom metadata types to provide any additional configuration information that you need within your code. A beauty of using custom metadata types with this feature is that it provides you a great flexibility on what you can package and what you can allow your subscribers to define. For example, as a package developer, I might want to define a trigger that is going to be executed on account and on some custom objects that are part of my package. Now, as a subscriber, once I install that package with a trigger, I look at the logic and I say, wow, this is so smart and clever, but I want to extend this logic to some of the entities that I have in my org. And that's super easy for like standard entities like opportunity, everyone knows about them. But I might have some custom objects that I define just in my org that you as a developer of the package have no idea about, but I want to apply the same logic on them. And I can do it as simple as defining a couple additional custom metadata type records that I would point to those entities where I wanted the trigger to be executed upon a safe. So that's kind of like a high level high level view of the trigger anatomy. And yeah.
Okay, thanks, Vlad. So, like Vlad was just talking, the three main components there that were shown in the anatomy. Here is like a snippet, sneak peek into the code to help you understand a bit more. So this is how our dynamic trigger metadata looks like, right? Like any other meta XML file. We are basically in this metadata, we are defining a relationship between the custom metadata type that you have and the Apex class that is defining this trigger logic. So like it's pretty clear from this snippet here, we have a class, Apex class called sentiment analysis save handler. And then another interesting thing is here I have different tags that I can use to set true or false to establish when the trigger should execute. So for example, I have a before update set to true. I have the after insert set to true here for this particular Apex class, for this trigger. And then tying it to the custom metadata type, right? So I have this tag called overtype that tells me it is being tied to the sentiment analysis config metadata type. And on this metadata type, the field custom field source object is actually defining the exact entity definition that needs to be updated when this dynamic trigger runs. So so this is how we are tying together the custom metadata type and its entity definitions to the Apex class that holds the trigger logic. Uh, and then the Apex class that we were just talking about. So it's a class that extends base save handler that has most of the logic there. You simply have one method that you need to override, which is the execute method. This is the method that contains your custom logic. What you do is you use this method called get configuration, which is nothing but getting you all the rows that are in your custom metadata type. And now once you have that configuration, once you have all those rows, you can do anything with it. So whatever your custom logic is for that trigger to fire, it then goes in the execute method, and it saves different entity definitions or different custom objects accordingly. So just a recap of what we talked about. So if you want to put together in steps, it's as simple as these 4 steps. You have a custom metadata type that you create that is supposed to store the relationship to entity definitions. And these entity definitions are nothing but the different objects that the trigger has to fire on. Along with that, along with entity definition, which is required, you can create any additional configuration, custom fields holding any additional configuration, for example, is active, or you want to add names there, and any other custom fields that you want to add there. The second thing that you need to do is add rows to that custom metadata type. And each of those rows are nothing but they are pointing out to the different entities that this dynamic trigger will fire on. Then you have the Apex class that is implementing your base save handler. And most importantly, you have a dynamic trigger metadata type that is tying these 2 things we just developed together. So the custom metadata type and the Apex class. Yeah, so where can you use it? There are several use cases depending on the advantages that Vlad kind of touched on earlier. So if you're a package developer, right now with dynamic triggers, you are empowered to develop entity agnostic code. Basically, you don't have to worry about the entities that are available on the with subscribers or the orders that they are set in. You basically don't have to provide them with a set of steps to set their application in a way that your package code can run. If you are a customer, you get more control over enable and disablement of triggers. You get transparency over execution order. Plus you now get the ability to encapsulate your business-wide logic or your org-wide logic into one single place. Unlike with regular triggers, you have to break down that logic and tie it to each specific entity every time. So for example, if I go over the first use case that I mentioned there, let's say you are developing an automation app for your customers for billing services for consulting, right? So today, how you would do that is you would tie your logic to these specific triggers, and then you would lay down steps for your customer to have a specific order of execution and tie these triggers to specific entities. You will also need to know what all entities are there that are being used in this app that you're building the automation for. With dynamic triggers, you don't need to know that. So what you need is you just need a custom metadata type. You will create a dynamic trigger. You have your custom logic in the dynamic trigger, and all your customer needs to do is to add rows to that. You can add some rows yourself, and then your customers can add further rows to tie it to further more entities that they want. So with dynamic trigger, you'll be able to build, let's say, this automation for a billing service without even knowing what kind of entities and what kind of apps, timesheet app, let's say, that your customer is relying on. So it kind of empowers you to build entity agnostic features. Uh, yeah, some other use cases there. Another interesting one is we have observed a lot of customers create these single line triggers. So even though they are better than those, so even though they are slightly better than regular Apex triggers, what ends up happening is you replicate these one line triggers to every entity anyway. So you still don't have that power right now. With dynamic trigger, you will be able to use just one line, those same one line triggers, but use the custom metadata type to tie it to several entity definitions in one place. Uh, yeah, so those are some of the use cases, and I'm sure we can find several more as we dig deeper into this. Roadmap, yeah, so for what Vlad mentioned, we are aiming at developer preview this spring 21 release, but then it's a pre-developer preview presentation, so things might change, but we are pretty optimistic on a spring 21 timeline right now. However, with developer preview and with all the feedback that you all provide, other customers provide, you need to incorporate that into the beta release. And so we are aiming at summer 21 right now. It could be a bit optimistic. We could move a release or two behind that. We should be prepared for that, right? And what follows the beta release is GA, which we are currently aiming at winter 22, and then some post-GA enhancements, which would focus on reordering of these triggers and some other enhancements that we want to add there. With that, I think that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Neha. Yeah, just again to repeat it, we're targeting a developer preview for Spring 21, available in Scratchworks. The reason for that is that we don't need to worry about our rollback plan if you do something crazy or use them in a way that we didn't anticipate. And after that, again, just to reiterate on what Neha said, all depends on the feedback that we receive and how fast or how quick we'll be able to incorporate that feedback before we go to GA. This is a lot of things we're still in discussions in terms of design and specific architecture decisions that we're making right now. But we're setting up a stage for this to go to dev preview.
Before we jump into the questions that we have in the chat room, I want to ask you a quick question. I think the answer is obvious, but you're building everything about dynamic triggers over the existing trigger infrastructure, right? Everything will be wrapped within the same transaction. Everything will respect the same, will follow the same trigger rules. So there's nothing fancy here. There's nothing other than the dynamic binding.
Yes.
I think the answer is like not yet, not in dev preview. The fancy part is gonna be later when we're gonna figure out the how you're gonna manage order of execution of the triggers. That is kind of not a developer preview goal, but our idea is we want to provide a more transparent way for you to manage order of execution of your triggers. And we probably start with dynamic triggers, where we want to provide you a way to define in what exact order those triggers should be executed, which currently is not something you can do with Apex triggers, let's say. And additionally, we want to provide built-in capabilities around activation, deactivation of triggers. So it's not just something that you need to worry about as a developer when you put it in a package, but it's a standard feature. So let's say you can programmatically enable, disable it when you run tests, or your subscribers can turn it off when they do some data loads. So I think those kind of other maybe less major capabilities, but I think something we're planning to do as well. But yeah, the major one is the dynamic binding.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. It's a very interesting roadmap, and definitely in the right direction. Because I guess that everyone, while writing a test or something, hey, I need to deactivate that trigger. Oh, damn it! Let's do it correctly. Let's try to build some class or whatever. Well, if you can provide everything as a whole experience, that will be awesome. I have a few questions here on the chat room. I'm going to read the one that I write down. Exactly what do you mean by managing order of execution? You're talking about the trigger order of execution, or are you going to have some other capabilities with triggers, with managing the order of execution?
Neha, do you want to take this one? Or one?
Yeah, I can take that, and then feel free to add if I miss anything. So order of execution is basically where when you install, first of all, when you install managed packages, when customers install managed packages, and they all have dynamic triggers in them, what orders would they be running in? Do we provide any reordering capabilities at the subscriber level? Uh, we don't know that yet, but that's something that could be a part of it. Plus, uh, if I'm not wrong, like flows, right? Or flows can have their own order of execution. So how does it tie into other entities that are not a part of that flow? So how does all of that tie together and uh, let's say save in a particular order? We don't have, I would say we're not, it's not a part of developer preview, but those are some things we want to start thinking after we have this basic framework out. Like how can, what are some of the other examples, like flows, formulas, process builders, how can their orders of execution tie into with other triggers?
Yeah, I think I would add just, just to again reiterate, we want to solve the order of execution problem for dynamic triggers first, as Neha mentioned. So let's say you install multiple packages that now all use dynamic triggers, and you have those triggers, let's say, on account, like 3 or 4 of them. You should be able to define in what order you want to execute them. It's that's like very basic things that we're planning to solve with dynamic triggers. But to add it to the bigger picture, I think as we do that for dynamic triggers, we want to open up the conversation internally for other teams of how can they onboard their triggerable features into the order of execution framework. Now we're talking probably, year, 2 years away from where we're today. So take it with a grain of salt, This is a very high level idea, but we want to provide the same way of like, hey, can I use the same order of execution frameworks that we built for dynamic triggers to define where the flow needs to be firing in what order, where it should regular Apex trigger fire in that sequence of different triggerable things, when validation rule should be firing, stuff like that. Again, this is like super high level, long term. I mean, we probably have a couple conversation about, we're not even yet ready to say what is it going to be for dynamic triggers. It just, we want to provide a tool for you to control, for you as developers to control the order of execution within your development context, for subscribers to control it within their subscriber org. And I know there are a lot of things we need to consider about it, but we want to solve that problem because right now there's no solution for that. It's completely black box. There's some like reverse engineering of people trying to figure out what's going to be executed when, but there's no control whatsoever.
Awesome, thanks.
Cool. So there's a question from Andres. Will this help solve the happy soup problems?
And happy soup, you mean like the org that is like pretty much contain way too many things that you don't know, understand how it work, and you're trying to untangle it in some way.
You want to untangle in two different packages, but there's a lot of dependency between those things. So you cannot put the classes here and the triggers there because they have to go together because they are linked and all the mess.
I don't think it would solve it like it would solve it dramatically because like, well, we don't expect people to jump and somehow migrate their stuff to dynamic triggers. I think overall it would reduce the confusion because now you have one class to manage instead of, I don't know, 15 different ones that are exactly the same. I don't know, Neha, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I think that's right. It doesn't dramatically solve anything, but yeah, over time you'll be able to detangle stuff and then use one custom metadata, right? Maybe to relate it to several custom objects or entity definitions.
Cool, thanks. Let's see, there's another one from Aldo. In the past, there were different open source libraries like microtriggers or mytriggers that tackle some of the issues you mentioned at the beginning of the session. How different is dynamic triggers against those frameworks?
I don't know, Neha, do you want to talk? I can talk
Yeah.
about it. Yeah, go ahead.
So I actually I have not come across micro triggers or my triggers, but I understand that some of the folks have tried to solve this problem on their own. Just today, I was talking to somebody, an internal ISV, and they had their own version of a solution, which is not exactly the same, but kind of giving them a bit more flexibility than regular Apex triggers. The difference I see with that is um, I've seen people able to customize and reduce stuff to, like, for example, I mentioned one line triggers, but I think it still ties strongly together to one entity. Now I don't know if micro triggers or my triggers there they decouple that and they uh, like open up that binding and change it, but some of the other solutions I've observed, they still tie to one entity, even though they are more flexible.
Yeah.
One other thing I've seen is that even if they tie to an entity, and then there are certain. I think I'm remembering this vaguely from some code within Salesforce. I saw it. It is still referring to certain conditions in a way that it ties it together to one of the entity's fields, where it again takes away that flexibility to tie it to any object.
Yeah, I think like with any frameworks, what I see the biggest benefit here is, like, don't get me wrong, some of those frameworks are very powerful. It's always a good practice for us to provide a little bit more guidance around those kind of things from Salesforce perspective, because right now, like, you might use one of those frameworks or you might not. You might provide some capabilities to, like, enable disable triggers that you build in. You might not. Kind of dynamic triggers, like, it's a step in a way of, like, unifying that experience for everyone who creates some code. And to what Neha said, all of those frameworks, like if you look, for example, at Andy Fawcett's rollup summary helper, that very popular thing that deploys all those triggers. At the end of the day, what it does, you need to select entities, you hit the save button or whatever the button it is, and it still deploys those one-line triggers into the work. So you end up with multiple triggers that doing exactly the same. So it kind of doesn't solve that problem of, like, abstracting the business logic away from the implementation. So I think the two main things is, like, yeah, none of them really solve that idea of, like, I have one source of truth completely. They solve it to some extent. You still need to multiple instances of triggers tied to one specific entity. And additionally, like, we're hoping with that to provide more generic framework for Apex trigger developers that they can utilize, and at the end of the day, subscribers and the admins and the work would benefit from it.
Awesome.
And just to add to it, I think, Vlad, it also makes everything standardized. Like it's a flow that we are controlling, and we are able to, like, we'll keep enhancing it. So it's not just this. So you it's like a continuous development process that will go on, and so continued features that will roll out on it. So
yeah, the thing with those frameworks, once you install it and you brought it up, like, it's really hard to, like, provide any updates into that framework. It's up to, like, developers, and the framework owner might not be able to provide you any updates if you already build it into your package. Versus, like, with this, like, as a standard feature, we can through releases and iterations constantly improve the experience.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
But yeah, we're trying to solve a lot of problems that you guys have been trying to solve.
Yeah, and make it more standard. So basically, this dynamic triggers is going to be a new metadata type, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what about in the trigger context variables? Are they going to still be needed, available, or in this extended class, like the trigger.new, trigger.old, and stuff like that?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't want to answer this question because I think I don't know the answer.
Okay, that's fine.
I probably better to take this question, ask someone who a little bit more sufficient as a.
Yeah.
Unless you
No.
know the answer, because I kind of like my.
So the only reason I'm saying I don't think so is because any examples of this execute like logic I've seen, I've always heard that you don't need them anymore, but I can confirm and give a better answer.
Okay,
on
thank
this
you.
one.
And the idea behind this is to have like less handler classes that can handle multiple objects, right? To make it more abstract.
Definitely.
And can you show, I guess you showed already, what does this metadata looks like? Was that the XML, I think?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right there. I have a question right there. I think Fede, you're in the same page because we're chatting. I think that what's the overfill, the source object? That means that if I want to add more objects to that handler, I will need to modify the metadata, and the metadata will be the one who is going to do the tie between the logic and the object.
Yeah. So you have that over type that points to custom metadata type, and you can put whatever you want into that custom metadata type that you find useful for your trigger, right? But there's one required field that you need to link here in over field, which is entity definition relationship field. And that entity definition relationship field would pretty much tell what entity you want to execute that trigger on. So each record within custom metadata type would tell you to what entity it applies. So if you want to, let's say, add a trigger to account, you create one record and you say account as a source object _ C. You want to put it to custom object, you create second row and you point the source object field in that record to custom object of your choice, right? So custom metadata types does the binding in this case.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay.
And I think that was the last one. Let me see.
I have another question on how this dynamic triggers will work with the existing triggers. How is that coexistence of both metadata types?
I don't think so. I don't think they are supposed to tie in together to an existing Apex trigger. Vlad, am I wrong there?
Yeah,
but I think
no. Yeah, I think it's a different thing.
Yeah.
So Apex triggers would continue to exist. If the Apex trigger would still have a use case, a proper use case. If, for example, if you don't really care about the trigger logic applying to multiple entities, or maybe you're just too lazy to take advantage of order of execution kind of things, which we will try to decouple from dynamic triggers later. So it's kind of like you use it when you see a use case for it, but it does not necessarily replace Apex triggers.
And can you use both of them in the same object?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I think the next question will be what about order of execution? I think what we're trying to do, again, that's a very high level discussion, that you know, Apex triggers, regular Apex triggers will be still executed in whatever order they executed today.
Mhm.
And after that, we'll have a block reserved for dynamic triggers, or that whatever that order of execution framework where you can organize your things.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So it would not interject into regular Apex triggers in any way.
Okay.
But again, this is like
Yeah,
you know,
high level.
so many forward in front of that
Okay.
forward-looking statement. But the idea is that they can coexist, and hopefully at some point we'll bring that, you know, order of execution framework in addition to dynamic triggers, and you'll be able to like also plug your regular Apex triggers into that. But that's more like you know, our vision for next couple of years probably.
Okay. I think this is really awesome, guys. I mean, thanks for being working into this direction, and I really appreciate all of this early glimpse about what's going on. Anytime that you need feedback, this group is always welcome to provide you. So if you want to showcase something in the future, you're more than welcome.
Yeah.
Fred, I don't know if we have any other question. If not, I think that this
nope.
is going to be a wrap. No, that's
Yeah.
it.
Thank you very much, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, no, thank you. I think the only thing I would add on the feedback, as we're pretty confident right now that it's going to be dev preview in spring, and the way we're planning the dev preview, it will be self-serviced in a Scratchworks, so you don't need to call me to enable it for you. You can just modify a definition file, or Neha in this case. Like, don't call me about this. This is her feature. I'm here just because, you know, I know Alda. And always nice to see him, right? Taking the opportunity to talk to him. But anyway, so that will be self-service. So hopefully, you know, all of you will be able to go to release notes in spring and see that it's out, enable it in your Scratchwork, and, you know, try it out, and like share all the feedback on how lame it is or how great it is. And we'll have a group and stuff, you know, set up, and Trailblazer groups, and
Yeah.
Oh, of course. So we will. Vlad, Neha.
Yeah, and then we get closer to it, you'll see all of that coming up.
Guys, thank you very much. I think that you deserve a big round of applause from wherever you are, because yes, it was really cutting edge technology with all this stuff, and we really appreciate that you came here to the group to present this kind of stuff. So guys,
thank you for having us.
yeah.
No, this is not going to be the last time that you're going to be in this group with other stuff. So.
Well, no, next time we have to be in person, man. I don't care.
Oh, Vlad, please, dude. After pandemic, we're gonna have everyone here back in Punta del Este or some city in Latin America. That's
Sounds good.
What I say.
Well, thank you, guys.
Thanks for
thank
joining us.
Thank you. So nice to meet you all.
You're welcome to. Well,